Marxism and Other Western Fallacies. An Islamic Critique by Ali Shari'ati. This is a Pliskin audiobook production. Preface. This is a book that speaks for itself too eloquently to need a lengthy and laudatory introduction. The appreciation of its intrinsic interest may, however, be enhanced by an awareness of the political and intellectual context in which it was produced, that of Islamic Iran moving inexorably forward to the heroic destruction of one of the most hideous tyrannies of modern times, and the immense task of creating a new state, society, economy, and culture. Among the architects of this movement, the most important is indisputably Imam Khomeini himself, who in rare, almost unique fashion has come not only to exercise political and religious leadership, but also to be the symbol of Iranian nationhood, and beyond that, a precious exemplar of the human ideal of Islam. But other than Imam Khomeini, no one has had a more penetrating influence than the writer of this work, the late Ali Shari'ati. We will not repeat here the detailed and analytical biography of Shari'ati that has been published elsewhere, but instead draw attention to the amplitude and depth of this posthumous influence on the Iranian Revolution. In all the diverse speeches, lectures, and writings of Shari'ati, there is barely a single reference to the political, economic, and other miseries of Pahlavi Iran, and yet it is necessary now to designate him as the chief ideologue of the Iranian Islamic Revolution. His lectures at the Husseiniya-i-Irshad in Tehran and in other forums around the country, the texts of which were generally recorded, transcribed, and disseminated throughout Iran, awakened new interest and confidence in Islam, not merely as a private form of worship, but as a total worldview, Jahanbini, one of the favorite terms, fully autonomous, superior to the creeds and ideologies of past and present, and bearing in its heart a revolutionary mission. A large number of the secularly educated intelligentsia who had become alienated from Islam, and thereby from their society and the masses of the Iranian nation, were drawn again to Islam as the pivotal point of both personal existence and national destiny by the eloquence, range, and originality of Shari'ati's thought. He had a style unique among modern Muslim thinkers. He had mastered, in every sense of the word, the intellectual legacy and actuality of the West, and eschewing apologetics, superficial modernism, and the mechanical coupling of the best of both worlds, he was able to set against it a coherent, fresh, and powerful vision that millions of Iranians found inspiring and convincing. Further, Shari'ati endowed the discussion of religious topics in Iran with a new tone of thought, a new style of discourse, and a whole set of new terms. This indeed was a revolutionary achievement. This achievement bore fruit in the 12 months of intensified struggle, beginning in January 1978, that led to the overthrow of the Pahlavi dynasty and the birth of the Islamic Republic of Iran. As the mosques of Iran became the ideological and organizational centers of the revolution, echoes from the work and ideas of Ali Shari'ati could be heard in many of the sermons and addresses that inspired the Iranian Muslim people to seek martyrdom. Memorable sentences from his writings served as ready-made revolutionary slogans, without need for any elaboration or commentary, and they were inscribed on banners carried in all of the great demonstrations of the Iranian Revolution. The martyr is the heart of history. Every day is Ashura. Every place is Karbala. Most importantly, many of those who with their blood bought the foundation of the Islamic Republic in this world, and paradise in the hereafter, were, directly or indirectly, the pupils of Shari'ati. On April 23, 1979, a terrorist group by the name of Forkan assassinated General Mohammad Vali Karani, first chief of staff of the Iranian armed forces after the revolution. This was followed on May 1 by the murder of Ayatollah Murtaza Mutahhari, a close associate of Imam Khomeini, and there weeks later by an attempt on the life of Ayatollah Hashemi Rafsanjani. Furqan also claimed responsibility for those crimes. In a communiqué forwarded to the Tehran newspaper Ayandagan, always eager to print such material, before it was closed down by the revolutionary prosecutor. The anonymous hands of Furqan wrote that they were in the service of the thought of Shari'ati and attempting to realize his alleged vision of an Islam without akhunds, i.e., institutionalized religious leadership. It is highly probable that is ultimately the command of persons owing their allegiance to the former regime, and possibly also to the American patrons of that discredited tyranny. Certainly, American officialdom has begun showing a remarkable interest in the work of Shari'ati. For example, in January, the State Department began making inquiries concerning his thought and influence, and 3 months later, attempts were made to recruit someone to brief Cutler, then ambassador-designate to Iran, on the same subject. Once the activities of Furqan are considered in the context of continual imperialist activity to destabilize the Islamic Republic of Iran, they appear as a tactic designed to create a dichotomy in the Islamic movement. On the one side, the posthumous following of Shari'ati, anti-clerical in its attitudes, and opposing them, those loyal to the religious leadership, above all Imam Khomeini. Given this probable counter-revolutionary direction of the activities of Furqan, it may be conceded that some of the followers of the movement, those entrusted with the business of killing, genuinely believe in the necessary for eradicating the ulama. All too numerous in Iran are young people whose acquaintance with Islam is recent and superficial, and for whom Islam means, above all, a permanent and unbridled revolutionary fervor. As the late Ayatollah Mutahhari pointed out, hypocrites always need fools to carry out their plans, and it is likely that Furqan is indeed an alliance of scheming hypocrites and gullible fools. The most effective way to recruit the fools, it appears, has been to invoke Shari'ati as the alleged ideologue of anti-clerical Islam. Because certain pseudo-academic authorities have attempted to legitimize this claim of Furqan to the legacy of Shari'ati, we would like to clarify here the attitudes that Shari'ati did in fact hold toward the ulama, the traditional leaders. It is obvious that he was not of their number, and that his ideas and expression bore a modern stamp that did not always correspond to their taste. His works are replete with references to Western thought and history, and even though these references are for the most part negative, they must have had a jarring effect on an extremely traditionalist audience. Shari'ati discerns, moreover, as a perpetual and universal sociological phenomenon, the existence of an official clergy, allied with the oppressive state and the holders of wealth, as major component in the system of injustice. Such a clergy may exist even in an Islamic and Shia setting, and Shari'ati designated the celebrated Bakir Majlisi, d. 1699, as a representative of that class, the function of which is to destroy rather than to serve religion. None of this means, however, that Shari'ati rejected the institution of religious leadership. Non-traditional is different from anti-traditional, and criticism of certain religious leaders of the past by no means implies a partial, or still less, a total, and repudiation of those of the present. Shari'ati clarified his attitude to the ulama by denying them official, rasmi, standing on the one hand, and by regarding them as fulfilling an essential need, zarurat, on the other. That is, donning the garb of the religious scholar confers no privilege or special status, and is in no way akin to being ordained a Christian priest. There is a real and practical need for the cultivation of expertise in religious knowledge, and herein lies the function undertaken by the ulama on behalf of the community. In addressing themselves to this task, the ulama are not merely legitimate, they are indispensable. It should further be noted that many of the particular criticisms of the social and political shortcomings of the ulama made by Shari'ati have also been raised with some insistence by Imam Khomeini himself. In the lectures he gave at Najaf in 1969, Khomeini repeatedly castigated those religious scholars who confined their attention to the minor details of ritual purity for betraying the dignity and true mission of their class 3. Despite differences of tone and emphasis, both Shari'ati and Imam Khomeini have contributed to the revival of religious thought and activism in Iran, and their influences have been exercised in largely complementary fashion. Anyone only slightly acquainted with the Iranian Revolution knows that countless Iranians regard themselves simultaneously as the followers of Imam Khomeini and as the disciples of the late Ali Shari'ati, and this entails neither divided loyalties nor mental contortions. Those who hope to exploit the ignorance and excessive fervor of a minority of young Iranians in order to create warring camps in the Islamic Revolution and thereby to destroy it are liable to be disappointed. The Iranian Revolution has been, among other things, an implicit repudiation of Marxism as a revolutionary ideology and as a doctrine relevant to the problems of Iranian society or valid for humanity at large. In the West, much was heard, during the course of the Iranian Revolution, about an unnatural alliance between Marxists and Muslims, which was bound to end with the Marxists swallowing up the Muslims after the overthrow of the Shah. By contrast, few observers in the West paid any attention to the grotesque array of powers, great and small, that supported and applauded the Shah. Events since the revolution itself have proven, however, how weak and ineffective the Iranian left really is. This situation is partly the result of the errors and even crimes committed over the years by various Marxist groups in Iran. But it is also the result of an ideological debate and confrontation that was carried on both in Iran and in the Iranian revolutionary diasporas during the last decade or so of the Pahlavi dictatorship. The opposition of Muslim and Marxist is by no means over, either in Iran or elsewhere. But the Iranian Revolution certainly shows the debate to be going in favor of the Muslims. A number of important and influential refutations of Marxism have helped to achieve this result. We should mention Darsha-i Darbarai Marxism, Lessons on Marxism, by Jalal ud-Din Farisi, Naqdi va Daramdi bar Tazad-i Dialektiki, A Critical Introduction to the Theory of Dialectic Contraction, by Abdul Karim Saroush, and the various writing by Ali Shari'ati, especially the present collection. What distinguishes all of these books, particularly those of Shari'ati, and sets them apart from most critiques of Marxism attempted elsewhere in the Islamic world, are 1. An intimate knowledge of Marxism and its philosophical foundations, and 2. The attempt to point out logical contradictions within Marxism, instead of adducing scriptural arguments to underline the well-known differences between Islam and Marxism. Shari'ati is aided in his task of refutation by a thorough acquaintance with the predecessors of Marxism in European thought and the circumstances of intellectual history that have left an indelible Western stamp on the doctrine, despite its having been exported to the Third World as a supposed means for combating the West. His critique of Marxism is situated, moreover, in the context of a coherent vision and statement of Islam as ideology. It is plain that his strictures on Marxism are not motivated by mere negative animus. The combination of these factors permits an analysis and a refutation that are serene and self-assured, as well as radical and uncompromising. The bulk of the present work consists of a series of privately given lectures, the text of which was published under a succession of different circumstances. After the release of Ali Shari'ati from his second imprisonment in 1977, the text was serialized in the Tehran daily newspaper Kayhan from February 15 to March 15, 1977, under the title Man, Marxism, and Islam. This printing took place without the consent of Shari'ati and was intended by the Shah's regime to discredit him by planting the suggestion that he had decided to collaborate, and that this indeed was the reason for his release from prison. Shari'ati protested, and even attempted to take legal action against the editors of Kayhan, but to no avail. The text was then reprinted abroad in book from under the title Man, Islam, and Western Schools of Thought. This text in turn became the basis for numerous copies circulated during the Year of Revolution, and it is also the basis for this translation. Our title for the series, Marxism and Other Western Fallacies, is the coinage of the editor. The second and briefer text contained this volume, Mysticism, Equality, and Freedom, was published for the first time in 1978 in the second volume of Shari'ati's collected works, pages 61 to 90. Since it discusses some of the same major themes as the first text, although with somewhat different emphases, it seemed useful to include it here as a kind of supplement. It was transcribed from a tape recording of one of Shari'ati's numerous lectures, and, because its publication was posthumous, could not be revised by him. His father, however, Muhammad Taqi Shari'ati, did have the opportunity to read over the manuscript before that printing and thought it appropriate to add, in the present edition, his name appears in parentheses after these notes. Both texts included in this volume are faithful and complete renderings of the original. The few liberties taken by the translator have been for the purposes of excising the repetitions and tightening the loose syntactic structure that almost inevitably characterizes the style of an extemporaneous lecture. The numerous quotations from Marx and other writers that occur in the texts are often approximate paraphrases made by Shari'ati in the course of his lecturing. No attempt has been made, therefore, to identify their precise sources. I would like to express my thanks to Heidi Bendorf for her assistance in reading and editing the manuscript. Humid Algar, Berkeley. Islamic Calendar, Zihijjah 1400, November 1979. Marxism and Other Western Fallacies. On Humanism. It is virtually impossible to agree upon a precise and logical definition of what is human, since such a definition will vary according to the scientific perspective, philosophical school, or religious belief under consideration. Nor has science been able to remove the mystery from this microcosm. As Alexis Carrel said, to the same extent that man has been occupied with external world and has achieved progress there, he has become distanced from himself and has forgotten his own reality. It is no accident that Carrel, founder of La Fondation Française pour l'étude des problèmes humains and one of the most outstanding figures of our age, spoke of man as the unknown. Nevertheless, one cannot abandon the attempt to achieve knowledge of man, to form an accurate conception of his essence and substantive reality, since, to begin with, knowledge of the human means knowledge of ourselves, and without it we are enveloped in such a darkness of self-ignorance that the shining lamp of science, awareness, is incapable of guiding us anywhere. This deficiency amounts to a calamity that, despite man's stunning successes in the world of science, has deprived him of a correct understanding of the meaning of life, of the significance of his own existence. According to Dewey, it shows that he is weaker and more ignorant in self-governance than ancient man. Now, knowledge of this unknown, Humanity is more urgently needed than any other kind of knowledge. This is truly vital information. It is no exaggeration to say that the basic reason all contemporary scientific, social, and ideological attempts to truly liberate mankind, or even impart to it a feeling of well-being, have failed is precisely this. The locus of these attempts and relative successes, which is the human being, has remained unknown or been forgotten in one way or another. It is altogether in vain that some of our foremost engineers and architects, on the basis of highly sophisticated technical principles, speak of the best and most convenient home before understanding the character of the family that must live in that home, what personality types it embraces, what attitudes and goals its members hold, what their basic needs are. Stunning advances have been made by the modern educational system, which include the latest scientific discoveries in the field of psychology and the great technological possibilities before it. Despite these, however, not only have there been no brilliant successes, other than the mobilization of a new generation to pursue scientific and technical learning and intellectual growth, but also from numerous standpoints, even by comparison with the instructional systems and disciplines of the past, the result has been a sterility. And so it is that modern man, more than any of his predecessors, can construct man, but knows less than any of them what it is he is constructing. As for his life, he can also live any sort of life he pleases, but he does not know how because he does not know why. These are the basic questions that no one can find answers for in the capitalist societies, and so one has the courage to frame in the communist societies. It is here that we may say why these new ideologies that try so hard to replace the ancient religions fall short of answering basic human needs, and why in the end they either lead people to a sense of futility or draw them into bondage. In addition, the philosophy of human life has no place in either of the two established worlds of Western liberalism and Eastern communism, for in both, what has been sacrificed is the free growth of the essential nature of man. Before we come to draw this conclusion, however, we must know the meaning of the essential nature of man. Then we may discuss its free growth, its alteration, and its degradation. Thus, we return to the need for a definition of the substance and essential reality of the human, because the human is the criterion for the worth or uselessness of every school and every way of life. Despite all the ambiguity that exists for science about the meaning of human existence, and despite the fact that each philosophical school and each religion explains it in a different way, we may agree as to the most essential shared bases upon which the major schools of scientific, religious, and social thought mount their view of man. The aggregate of these generally accepted assumptions may be designated humanism, referring to the school that proclaims its essential goal to be the liberation and perfection of man, whom it considers a primary being, and the principles of which are based on response to those basic needs that form the specificity of man. Today, we face four intellectual currents that claim, despite their mutually contradictory natures, to represent this humanism. 1. Western liberalism. 2. Marxism. 3. Existentialism. And 4. Religion. Western liberalism perceives itself as the principal heir of the philosophy and culture of historical liberalism, envisioned as a continuous flow of culture and thought issuing from ancient Greece and reaching its relative perfection in present-day Europe. Western humanism rests firmly on the foundation of that mythological perspective unique to ancient Greece, where between heaven and earth, the world of the gods and the world of men, competitiveness, opposition, and even a sort of jealousy obtain, and the gods are anti-human forces, whose every inclination and striving is to rule tyrannically over humanity and discourage it from attaining self-awareness, independence, freedom, and sovereignty over nature. Any human who sets foot upon any of these paths has perpetrated a great sin, has risen in rebellion against the gods, and is condemned to the most severe tortures and punishments in the afterlife. Humanity, we may say, is constantly seeking its liberation from this captivity. It strives to attain independence through the acquisition of divine powers in order to free its destiny from the grasp of the gods' omnipotence and bring it within reach of its own free will and choice. Of course, such a bond of enmity between men and gods was altogether natural and logical to the Greek myths, from certain point of view, proper and even progressive, since the gods in these myths constitute archetypes and expressions of natural forces such as seas, rivers, earth, rain, beauty, physical strength, economic abundance, and seasons of the year, as well as storms, earthquakes, illnesses, drought, and so on. Thus, the war between the gods and men is in reality the latter's war against dominance by the physical forces that rule over human life, will, and fate. Through its ever-increasing power and awareness, humanity strives to free itself from the rule of those forces and become its own ruler. It struggles to triumph over nature, the greatest established power that is, to supplant Zeus, who symbolizes the rule of nature over mankind. The greatest, most astounding sophistry that the modern humanists from Diderot and Voltaire to Feuerbach and Marx have committed is this: they have equated the mythical world of ancient Greece, which remains within the bounds of material nature, with the spiritual and sacred world of the great ancient religions. They have compared and even bracketed together humanity's relation to Zeus and its relation to Ahura Mazda, Rama, the Tao, the Messiah, and Allah, whereas these two sets of relations are in Messiah, and Allah, whereas these two sets of relation are in truth antithetical. In the former world, Prometheus, who gave the divine fire to mankind, first robs the gods of the fire as they sleep and brings it secretly to earth, and then is sentenced for this sin to suffer tortures at the hands of the gods. In the world of the last of these, God's highest-ranking angel, Iblis, becomes accursed of God because, unlike the rest of the angel, he refuses to prostrate himself at the feet of Adam, as God has ordered. Furthermore, the divine fire, in the form of the heavenly light of wisdom, of revelation, is entrusted by God to his prophets, so that it might be brought to humanity, and with the aspirations that accompany it, hope and fear of God, summon Adam's progeny from realms of darkness to this light. We see that in this case, in contrast to Zeus, God wishes humanity to be free of the great yoke of slavery to nature. He proclaims its road to deliverance to be the pursuit of that same Promethean light. We must conclude that in the world view of the great religions, God summons humanity to victory over Zeus and proclaims, "All the angels have prostrated themselves at the feet of Adam, and land and sea have been made tame for you." Thus, in the mythic world view of ancient Greece, it is natural and logical that a humanism should develop in opposition to rule by and worship of the gods, the archetypes of nature, and that there should exist an opposition between humanism and theism, or in this instance, polytheism. On this basis, Greek humanism, through denial of the gods, disbelief in their rule, and severance of the bond between man and heaven, struggled to arrive at an anthropocentric universe, to make man the touchstone of truth and falsity, to take the human form as the criterion of beauty, and to assign importance to the components of life that enhance human power and pleasure. Inasmuch as this anthropocentricity took the form of opposition to the heavenly, it became earthly and tended toward materialism. Thus, humanism in the Western perspective from ancient Greece to present-day Europe, has been drawn into materialism, and it has undergone a similar fate in the liberalism of the encyclopedists, in Western bourgeois culture, and in Marxism, also inducing humanism in the West to take the form of something all the more antithetical to theism, was the Catholicism of the Middle Ages, which set Christianity, regarded as religion per se, at odds with humanity. It maintained the same opposition between heaven and earth that had obtained in ancient Greece and Rome, and, with its Greek-style exegeses of original sin and man's expulsion from paradise, it represented man as helplessly condemned because of divine displeasure to an inferior world, and declared him to be an abject, reprehensible, and weak sinner. It accepted only that class of human society known as the clergy, the bearers of the Spirit, and held that the only means of salvation for the rest of the people lay in following them without why or wherefore, in blind imitation, and through membership in the institution of God on earth were administered. This sort of thinking pitted theism against humanism, so the road to the realization of divine rule necessarily led past the altar on which humanism was sacrificed, thus disappearing in the Middle Ages. In science and culture, in life and morals, even in the art and aesthetics of the Middle Ages, are depictions of the supernatural and superhuman, the Holy Spirit, the Savior, the angels, various miracles. If the human figure appears, it is only in the persons of the apostles and saints, and even then, their human forms are enshrouded head to toe in long, loose-fitting garments, and generally speaking, their faces are veiled or obscured by a halo of celestial light. Literature, the transmission of these tales. Art, the depiction of these fables. Science, the validation of these conceptions. Morals, the suppression of all natural desires in order to atone for original sin. Life in this world, it must be sacrificed in order to achieve life in the next. We see everywhere in medieval Catholicism that it is by the negation of genuinely human traits that man is to reach God. That is to say, he is to become the object of God's good pleasure. How closely this Christian God resembles Zeus. Thus, if we may speak of the post-Renaissance humanism of modern Europe as a continuation of the humanism of ancient Greece, we may speak equally well of a celestialism in medieval Christianity as being a continuation of the celestialism of the Greek myths. In the West, whether during the Middle Ages or modern times, everyone draws from the wellspring of Greece, the history of. Western culture is the persistence of these two contrasting currents that issue from the same spring, whether we refer religion or science. Now the situation becomes clearer. Both these divergent streams of today have their fountain in Greek humanism. Bourgeois liberalism and Marxism alike share, in theory and in practice, this human materialism. Voltaire and Marx both closed their eyes to the spiritual dimensions of the human essence. Bourgeois liberal society and organized communist society ultimately converge in a single view of humanity, human life, and human society. The bourgeois tendencies of the advanced communist societies, which can no longer be simply dismissed, are no accident, no aberration, no revisionist deviation, because everything culminates in man, and it is only natural that those philosophies that have a similar conception of man, no matter what their starting point, should finally enter upon the same road and have the same final destination. At any rate, Western bourgeois liberalism and Marxism both boast of their humanism. The former claims by leaving individuals free to think and to pursue scientific research, intellectual encounter, and economic production to lead to a blossoming of human talents. The latter claims to reach the same goal through the denial of those freedoms. through their confinement under a dictatorial leadership that manages society as a single organization on the basis of a single ideology that imparts to peoples a monotonous uniformity. The real philosophy of man and life, however, is the same that lies dormant within the liberal bourgeois philosophy. The extension of the life of the bourgeoisie to all members of society. So it is perhaps not in jest that it has been said, "Is not Marxism more bourgeois than the bourgeoisie?" Well, it is jesting, which, from the point of view of humanism, is an actual fact. Just as the bourgeois liberalism of the West sees itself as the heir to historical humanistic culture, and Marxism presents itself as a path for the realization of humanism, of the whole man, so existentialism is a humanism, and of course a more rightful claimant to humanism than its predecessors. There is still a fourth great intellectual current, older and more deeply rooted than all three of these, and that is the religious worldview. Given that each religion proclaims its mission to be the guidance of humanity to its ultimate salvation, each necessarily has its own specific anthropology, in that one may not speak of human salvation until the meaning of the human has been clarified. Thus, all religions begin with a philosophy of creation and of human creation. Accordingly, using these four varied intellectual streams current in today's world, which have conceived of humanity as a principle or a principal species and base thereon their claims for applicability, we may attempt a definition of man that will serve as a single point of departure to the matters at issue. The radicalists, who were among the most outstanding exponents and intellectuals of the new humanism of 18th and early 19th century Europe, proclaimed in a manifesto that they published in 1800, "Set aside God as the basis of morals and replace him with conscience." They held that man is a being that in and of himself possesses a moral conscience, which in their view springs from his original and essential character, and which his human nature requires. This reliance upon human nature, as well as upon moral conscience, forms the fundamental basis of the Western atheistic humanism of the present age. With the advent of the age of scientific analysis, and in particular the development of sociology, which has disarmed psychology and put it to flight, human nature as an underlying principle became subject to, first doubt, and then outright denial. At that point, moral conscience, instead of supposedly springing from the depths of this nature, was transformed into a social conscience rooted in the necessarily mutable aspect of the human social environment, and so likewise mutable. Thus, morals as a set of sacred and were nearly eliminated. Nonetheless, the new humanism upon which Western bourgeois liberalism as a system is based regards humanity as possessing eternal moral virtues and noble supramaterial values for which man is the essential focus. It is at this point that it places its reliance upon man in and of himself, as against nature or the supernatural. This humanism arrogates human morals as a whole from religion, but while denying their religious rationale, it proclaims the possibility of spiritual development and growth in adherence to the moral virtues without belief in God. On this matter, there are two differing aspects of Marxism. One has Marx opposed to the other capitalist order of his time and attacking it forcefully, and the other has him go on to set forth a properly communist social order. In the latter, the affirmative aspect of Marxism, it seems that Marx allowed his marvelous sensitivity to human moral values to be overshadowed by his revolutionary enthusiasm for the politics and economics of communism, and thus allows himself to be transformed into just another political leader, hungry for power and enamored of political triumph. However, in his critical phase, The aspect of Marx that is more intriguing and has attracted the hearts and minds of so many of those oppressed by capitalism. He shows this sensitivity clearly when he attacks the system as one that degrades the higher values of humanity. Assuming a mystical tone, he speaks of humanity as zealous, self-aware, truthful, proud, free, knowing, endowed with moral virtues, as having become alienated from itself in the heartless, oppressive, unfeeling system of mechanism, and in the exploitation, moral corruption, and egotism of capitalism. He cries out, "Work is essential to humanity. Capitalism regards it as a material product and assigns a monetary value to it, so the worker is made a slave to his stomach." When he speaks of the principle of production, however, the value of the tools of production, the principle of economic abundance, and in particular, the creation of an economic plan for all society under socialism, this mystical tone changes to a materialistic tone. In the negative, critical aspect of Marxism, the glorification of humanity reaches a pitch that has prompted such scholars as Aron, Duverger, and even Henri Lefebvre, in jest or seriously, to speak of a mystical humanism in Marx's critical and philosophical works. Existentialism, with prodigious philosophizing, speaks of humanity as a separately spun cord loose in the world, a being having no determinative character or quality owed to God or nature, but capable of choice, and thus constructing and creating its own reality. In the great Eastern religions, humanity has a unique relationship with the God of the world. In the religion of Zoroaster, mankind is the companion of Ahura Mazda, and even allies itself with him in the great battle of creation, for the sake of victory of the good over Angra Mainyu and his hosts. In the mystical religions based upon the unity of existence, and at the heart of them all, Hinduism, God, mankind, and love are all seen as engaged in a sort of scheme to recreate the world of existence. Man and God in this religion are so intermingled as to be essentially inseparable, as they likewise appear in the works of our great Sufis. In Islam, although the interval stretching from man to God extends to infinity, that from God to man is altogether eliminated. Man is presented as the sole being within creation, having the divine spirit, bearing the responsibility of the divine trust, and finding incumbent upon it the assumption of divine qualities. The most basic of the specifically human qualities, by the general consent of humanists, may now be delineated. Man is a primary being. That is, among all natural and supernatural beings, man has an independent self and a noble essence. Man is an independent volition. This is his most extraordinary and inexplicable power. Volition in the sense that humanity has entered into that chain of causation upon which the world of nature, history, and society are completely dependent as a primary and independent cause, and continues to intervene in and act upon this deterministic series. Free and choice, his two existential determinations, have imparted to him a godlike quality. Third man is an aware being. This is his most outstanding quality. Awareness in the sense that, through the wonderful and miraculous power of reflection, he comprehends the actualities of the external world, discovers the secrets hidden to these senses, and is able to analyze each reality and each event. He does not remain on the surface of sensible and effects, but discerns what is beyond the sensible, and induces the cause from the effect. In this way, he both transcends the limits of his sense and extends his temporal ties into the past and the future, into times in which he has no objective presence. He acquires a correct, broad, and profound grasp of his own environment. In the words of Pascal, man is nothing more than a delicate reed. A humble drop is sufficient to annihilate him, But even if all the world undertakes his perdition, he is nonetheless nobler than all the world. The world is unaware that it is annihilating man, but man knows he is being annihilated. That is to say, awareness is a nobler substance than existence. Man is a self-conscious being. This means he is the only living being possessing knowledge of his own presence. He is able to study himself and thus to analyze, know, evaluate, and consequently change himself as a being independent of himself. Toynbee, that great contemporary philosopher of history, says, "Today's human civilization has arrived at the highest stage of its historical perfection, in that it is only today's civilization that knows itself to be in decline." Man is a creative being. This creation aspect of his behavior sets him altogether apart from nature and places him beside God. It puts him in possession of a quasi-miraculous power that enables him to transcend the natural parameters of his own existence, grants him a limitless existential expansion and breadth, and places him in a position to enjoy what nature has not given him. It also gives him this power in relation to the heart of nature. What he wishes for that does not exist in nature, he creates. Thus it was by this creative power of his that in the first stage of his development he produced tools, and in the second, the arts. Sixth, man is an idealistic being, a worshipper of the ideal. By this is meant that he is never content with what is, but strives to transform it into what ought to be. That is why he is constantly engaged in recreating, and why he demonstrates that he is the only being, not the product of, but rather the producer of his environment. Or to put it simply, why he is constantly engaged in making reality conform to his idea. Thus, not only is he in a state of constant movement toward perfection, but, in contrast with other living beings, he determines the course of his own evolution and can exercise foresight in relation to it. Idealism is the major factor in human movement and evolution. It leaves no room for staying contentedly within the fixed confines of existing reality, of nature or of ways of life. It is this force that constantly compels man to reflect, discover research, realize, invent, and create in the physical and the spiritual realm. Crafts, art, literary pursuits, and all the riches of human culture are manifestations of the idealistic spirit of this being that never resigns itself to the situation that the world has provided for it. 7. Man is a moral being. It is here that the very significant question of value arises. Value consists of the link that exists between man and any phenomenon, behavior, act, or condition where a motive higher than that of utility is at issue. It might be called a sacred tie, as it is bound up with reverence and worship to the extent that people feel it justifiable to devote or sacrifice their very lives to this tie. Moreover, this is likewise worth considering. There is no question of a natural, rational, or scientific justification here. And also, this sentiment, as the most sublime existential manifestation of the human species, is acknowledged in all religions and cultures throughout history as constituting the greatest of resources, the grandest of glories, the most precious of emotions, the most miraculous of events. From those who have neglected their own material existence for the sake of art, literature, and science, to the religious martyrs, the truth-seekers, and the great heroes of each nation. From the person who, in marriage, chooses love over expediency, to the one who, for the sake of belief, country, or humanity, has closed his eyes to personal love or even to self, all are creators of human values in human life. Value and utility are two opposing terms, and what grants man, a non-material being, an independence from, as well as superiority over, all our other natural beings is his high regard for value. Values have no existence in nature, no external material identity. Therefore, realism cannot admit the existence of values, since without humanity, there would be no values. We come here to the inescapable conclusion that values emanate from man and are therefore of the ideal or subjective order, for which reason the realists are obliged to deny them. But how can one deny the most noble existential manifestations of the human species? Of course, to do so is a difficult and likewise shameful, deadly task. But what other recourse has the realist? Unless, that is, he resorts to acknowledging man's precedence over material reality or the precedence of mind over matter, which assertions themselves serve to deny realism. But the realist philosophers, e.g. the materialists and naturalists who depend solely upon philosophical and scientific notions of sociology, psychology, and anthropology, do not hesitate to deny the existence of values, dismissing them as superstitions, vain suppositions, inherited habits, or social mores resulting from material forms, or as emotional states originating in the physiology of this talking animal. With their merciless and unfeeling pseudo-scientific analysis, the realists corrupt the essential sanctity and virtue of values and vivisect them as one cuts apart a living, delicate system into dead substance and elementary material components. Thus, when confronted with a person who forgets himself in the pursuit of scientific discovery, or who dedicated his life to his country, or chooses ideals over self-interest, or who ascribes greater value to beauty and goodness than to personal pleasure and advantage, the realists explain his feelings just as they would explain participation in a rite of circumcision. It is precisely here that Marxism stumbles into what is, for an ideology, a very weak position in which to be caught. For one thing, Marx is not merely a philosophical materialist, free to say along with Sartre, whatever you choose out of freedom, free choice, and good intentions constitutes a value and a good, however much it might serve evil or base egoism. Marx is a social ideologist who has become political guide to the proletariat of his age and founder of a party on the stage of action, and is thus the promulgator of a specific program, who, in contrast to Sartre, says, "These are the things you must choose," and further, "You are held responsible for them, and in the face of these responsibilities, you must struggle and sacrifice to realize these specific ideals. That is to say, you must offer up all your material motives, economic needs, natural wants, personal advantages, and even your life for the sake of this struggle." There can be no doubt, therefore, that he speaks of a set of values, values inimical to self-interest and transcending human material existence. Thus, when he speaks of the capitalist system and bourgeois psychology as appraising human existential values in terms of money, drawing humanity into moral depravity, and building a corrupt society, he bases his thought on moral values. When he shows off the edifice of his thought, however, and discusses dialectical materialism, he struggles mightily to prove himself loyal to realism and to grant only all that fits the material and biological rationale of the natural science. And he follows the rest of the materialists, including the most hardened realists, in reducing human values to something with no foundation. Marx refers repeatedly and with pride to a piece of scientific legerdemain that he has brought into play for the sake of preserving human dignity, which is this: dialectics does not conceive of man as do other forms of naturalism and materialism, that is, as a fixed material entity in a clockwork universe, but rather presents him as a being in a state of evolution, moving forward with the historical dialectics. By this stratagem, Marx transfers humanity from the realm of nature to that of history. But man gains no nobility through this promotion. Since history, according to Marx, is the continuation of the movement of material nature, man, in the context of history, is ultimately returned to the mechanical nature of the naturalists, to be conceived of as a material entity. Thus, all the values that Marx bestows upon him in the context of society, he takes back from him with the hand of dialectical materialism. Here Chandel's very telling remark comes to mind. Marx, the philosopher, crushes all the substantive values of man under the wheels of the blind juggernaut of dialectical materialism. But Marx, the politician and leader, with the most fervid and electrifying praise of these values, mobilizes people for power and victory. Is not Marx's reliance on these values, in whose authenticity he does not believe, simply part of this battle tactics? If so, this is a most obvious case of political chicanery. At any rate, considering all the fundamental, uncontested assertions about man shared by the four prevailing modern intellectual currents under consideration, we may deduce the following definition. Man is a primary being in the natural world, having his own unique essence, and as a creation or as a phenomenon, is exceptional and noble. Because he possesses will, he intervenes in nature as an independent cause, possesses the power of choice, and has a hand in creating a new destiny for himself in contradistinction to his natural fate. This power brings him a commitment, a responsibility, which is meaningless unless articulated with reference to a system of values. At the same time, man is an idealistic being who strives to transform the actual into the true, that is, what is into what ought to be, whether in the realm of nature, society, or the self. This transformation provides for movement toward perfection within him. He is also a being who demonstrates in his acts a power antithetical to nature, in that through his acts, he recreates both the world's nature and his own. Having the power of creation, he uses it to further the development of both nature's and his own existence. Accordingly, by the creation of beauty, art, and literature, he gives the material world what it lacks, and by the creation of craftworks, he provides himself with what nature has not given him. Likewise, man is a thinking being, and with this transcendental aptitude he grows in consciousness of the world and himself, and also of his human condition in the world, in society, and in time. By means of thought, he broadens his existential scope beyond the confines of his physical existence, while his intellectual scope plunges deep below the surface of sensible phenomena and ascends to heights above the low rooftops of the material world. Where his environment comes to an end, he continues, in the process of existential sublimation that is endless within him. In sum, man bears a sacred substance, and from it flow sanctities, the worship of which is the most exalted of the supernatural and supralogical manifestations of his existence. Taken together, these form the human values, the values that have brought into being the acts of love, worship, and sacrifice known to spiritual, that account for all of humanity's glories and spiritual resources. Human values are sacred ideas, which, although their applicability may vary, are eternal and absolute and may change only as the human species changes or disappears. It is said that Nietzsche, the great philosopher, scarified his life to save a draft horse. The materialist mind considers such an act not only senseless, but disastrous and deserving of condemnation, because through it a genius rather than an animal has been lost. Still, there is in this wondrous human nature an extraordinary element, which, confronted with this incident, glorifies it and gives it praise befitting something sacred. It attributes great worth to this transaction, Because Nietzsche, by sacrificing himself, has created a value, a moral value, which is higher than the existential value of one body, even that of a genius. What produces this kind of judgment and motive in man is the transcendental dimension of human existence, in denial of which materialism and dialectical materialism have denied man, and in affirming which they have denied themselves.